So in terms of the technology side of it, this thing here is the Dolby Atmos renderer. This has sort of evolved over a period of time. Like I say, this is something that started in the cinema, then it went into the home entertainment environment, and it's been there and it's quite mature now. In fact, we don't really need to do much to support the home entertainment post-production kind of world, because they're all up and running, they know what they're doing. The basic basis of the format is that you've had two speakers for stereo for 50 years. So you've been mixing everything, music or whatever you've been doing, you've been mixing it across those two speakers. Early days of stereo was one microphone pointing at that side of the orchestra, one microphone pointing at that side of the orchestra. That microphone became that speaker, that microphone became that speaker. You sat here, and if you're at the same angles, you got the phantom image, perfect, crystal clear phantom image, as though you were there sitting in front of that orchestra. That was the principle, and that's how it worked. But of course, yes, you did have orchestras and big bands around that time, kind of early 50s. But then you started getting rock and roll coming through and people making do and making things, new exciting sounds. So there was the kind of the really nerdy technical side of it that was using Blumlein cross pairs, and then the introduction of a Decker tree where they would have a third microphone up the middle to bring the focus of the center up a little bit. But it was all based upon angles and maths. Meanwhile, you also had the rock and roll world just sticking microphones closer and closer to drum kits and stuff like that, and then mixing them down and bouncing things across tracks as multi-track became a thing. So no longer was the stereo, essentially recording down to two channels to distribute it as two channels on record. You now had this bit in the middle, which was a multi-track from 4-track, then to 8-track at the end of the 60s, then closely followed by 16-track, 24-track, and so on. So at that point, you were dealing with individual items. They'd usually been recorded together. You were starting to look at the overdubbing side of it, where you would do the band track first and then a vocal separately or an extra guitar solo or whatever it might be. And so by the end of the 60s, there was a push again from sort of the record labels, the manufacturers of record decks and things like that, to say, right, we're going to try and make more of stereo rather than it being this super high-end sort of thing that you only really got in studios. Let's try and make this the way that everybody at home listens to music. Most people have had a mono gramophone at that point, so obviously they were looking to get two speakers into people's homes instead. And then so at that point, within the pop and rock world, you listen to some of the Beatles tunes like Lady Madonna. You've got the piano on that side, you've got the drums on that side, and the vocal up the middle. And that's because around that period of time, it was quite rare to have a pan pot. Pan pots didn't come around the first time because you didn't need them when you were just dealing with microphones and channels, left or right or both. That's all you needed to worry about. So when you listen to Crosstown Traffic by Jimi Hendrix, and there's a guitar that goes da-da-da-da-da at the beginning of it, which we all love. It's the equivalent of somebody's first Atmos mix where they ping things around the room. It's just a bit of a novelty because they were probably in a studio with a pan pot for the first time. Anyway, and actually at that point in time, sort of thinking about the Beatles, Lady Madonna thing, is that probably wasn't done by Jeff Emmerich and the people that were working on the Beatles record. It was probably a side engineer. It was just like, can you do this stereo thing? I mean, you hear rumours and stuff about how that went down. And of course, the decision to put the piano there and the drums there is a weird one, but we all kind of just got used to it. And to a degree, you can sort of draw parallels a little bit with that situation with stereo 50 years ago. And now with Atmos is the way that, people's understanding of it, the way that people are working. We've had multi-channel surround sounds like 5.1 for a long time now, but the whole point of Dolby Atmos is that it's a scalable thing. So if we go back to 5.1, before we go into the renderer, this is a 7.1.4 room. So how did we get from 5.1 to this? Well, from stereo to 5.1 via quad at one point in the 70s. And then from 5.1, why did we end up with two speakers at the side? Well, that's because somebody said, well, we need the phantom image between there and there is very long. We could do with filling the side in. So when something pans across there, it comes from a real speaker. So it's a little bit more defined. Okay, cool. So it became 7.1. One's always the subwoofer. And then at some point, some clever person said, oh, wouldn't it be cool if we had sound coming from above us as well? And so all of the time, if you imagine, as I described, all of those people having those little plasticky home entertainment systems, which were 5.1 that they'd got from Curry's or Dixon's or whatever. That's showing my age. But At that point they might have been out, because there were only the real hi-fi home entertainment, home cinema enthusiasts that would go, right, I'm going to go for a 7.1 instead. Oh, and this 7.1.2, where there are speakers coming from above, of course, that takes it more and more out of the realms of anything that an average normal listener, would want to do, or even TV watcher, frankly. But of course, you get to that point, and then somebody's always going to say, well, but what about to the wide, the wides of a television or the screen, because you've got everything going on screen, but often it's really important to have detail to the sides off the screen. So you might have a 9.1, which some studios do, and so on. It could keep going. And then what about these two channels above? Well, actually, you're looking at a box there. So that box there is this box that we're sitting in, this room. Every Dolby Atmos studio is calibrated, with a little bit of an exception, but essentially every studio is calibrated so that you are inside. That box is the room you're sitting in. So if you imagine two speakers above you, which would be there and there, which would create a 7.1.2 system, as you pan up, you're not panning around a box, because as you go high, even if you pan to the top corner of the room, it's always going to come from the middle. So at that point, it was yet another pair of speakers that some enthusiast had to add onto their system, and even the most flashy millionaire is going to start questioning this. So the whole point of Atmos is it's scalable to whatever you're listening back to it on, and that goes all the way up to our screening room in our office. Is a Dolby Atmos, Dolby Vision screening room with 35 speakers in total. If you go to the Dolby Cinema in the West End, it's in Leicester Square. That's got 100 speakers in it. And that's where you kind of get the difference between an object and a bed. So a bed is a channel-based thing. As you can see, the first 10 inputs to the renderer here are in this weirdly purple rectangle. And they denote that this is a 7.1.2 bed. So you've got left, right, center sub, side, rear, top, essentially. And you might have noticed, as you've got into using DAWs over the years, that when you've gone above stereo, you will see, oh, there's a 5.1 bus. Oh, there's a 7.1 bus. You may even have seen a 7.1, 1.2 bus in the last, 4, 5, 6 years. And the panel was a square, rather than a pot between left and right, as a square, which I'll show you in a minute. And then it became a cube, rather like what you're seeing there. So that's always been addressing a particular speaker configuration, whether you're working in 5.1 for a DVD or 7.1.2 potentially for a Blu-ray or stereo or whatever you're on. But the whole point, one of the main points of Dolby Atmos is that you're mixing for the space, not for the speakers. So when you're mixing in this room, you're mixing for this 7.1.4 configuration. That means you can take that to any other 7.1.4 configuration, and it will sound the same. Obviously, every studio is calibrated to sound as similar as it possibly can. You've got PMCs, other studios have got Neumanns, others have got Focal, Genelec, blah, 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 blah. But ultimately, with everything in the right position, calibrated in the same way, it's a very, very similar experience. And then it's just down to what speakers you like. But what happens then if you play that on one of those Sonos 5.1.2 soundbars that's a single box at the front of the room under your telly, with speakers pointing at you and speakers at you and speakers actually pointing up to the ceiling and down to you, that's actually been channelized to a 5.1.2 system. Yes, it's creating a virtual rear by flying it around the room, but it's never going to be a 7.1.2 bed, as it were. So the whole point is that Atmos kind of folds down to all of the various things, but you can't keep folding up, and that's the point, really. So yeah, you can fold down from 7.1.2 very easily to 5.1, which we'll talk about a little bit in a while. You can even fold all the way down from here down to 2 channels of stereo and fold and sort of bring the center and split that across left and right. And there are various settings for that with the trim and down mix, which we'll get onto in a little while. I'm just keeping an eye on time because I tend to waffle. But this renderer is something that's been around from the theatrical days, looked very different then. Then it went to home entertainment and it became a little bit more streamlined. And At that point, you had two computers, a DAW and a Dolby Atmos renderer computer. Two computers, Pro Tools rig or whatever, feeding either via a digital connection or even an analog connection, 128 things from here out of there to 128 ins, which are the things on the left there. And then this machine would be running a version of this software, which would then render it out to whatever your monitoring configuration was in that particular room, which in this case is 7.1.4. Over the period of time, particularly around the time that music, became a thing for Dolby, again, which I'll go into a little bit of the history of that in a minute, it became evident that with music, you didn't necessarily need to have a DAW machine and a mastering machine. You could actually take that software and bring that into the same computer. And you could run this on lots of different DAWs. So this has never just been about Pro Tools or just been about Logic. Since the very start, pretty much all of the DAWs have been able to access the output being the Dolby audio bridge. So you take that from that computer, forget about any physical connection, bring it into here, and rather than going from Pro Tools or Logic or whatever into the renderer with any cables, it's just a virtual or an audio bridge, which is, which we can find on here. If you're working in Pro Tools, the way that we have this set up at the moment is exactly that way. Can you see the menu? Probably not. But the playback engine here, as you can see, is set to Dolby Audio Bridge. So that's taking away any other I/O capability, and it's just sending 128 outs of Pro Tools and into the renderer. And that's the same with all the DAWs. That's how it's been until fairly recently, which we'll get onto your point about Logic. Yeah, a couple of years ago, though, that started changing so that, and it was always kind of the plan, was that instead of having two computers, then one computer with two bits of software, obviously the perfect solution would be to actually make it one piece of software, and whatever that piece of software is that you love using, whether that's, Studio One by PreSonus, DaVinci Resolve, Cubase, Nuendo, blah, 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 and all of those, and Logic, and Pro Tools, I'm forgetting them all now. They've all now integrated the renderer, instead of it being two pieces of software, internal into that particular piece of software. So in the case of Pro Tools here, how can I show you this? Okay, so things have changed slightly. Don't want to walk before we can run here, because there's a few things I want to show you on the original renderer first. But we might as well show you this now. Is the way that this now connects. As you can see, that's currently set to the external renderer because we're going out of Pro Tools and setting up it in the kind of that old school way, as it were. But you can actually set this to an internal render, and then a lot of the functionality that you've got in the renderer is now built in. So you can basically work in Dolby Atmos without having to buy the extra software, without having to leave your session. And that's exciting artistically, because that means, I mentioned that initially a lot of the studios that we've got up and running have been stereo mixers that have been delivering stereo mixes for years, and to a very high standard. And that they've now got their Atmos system, so they can deliver Atmos as a separate thing after the event, because the record labels are asking for it. And typically that has meant that the workflow has been, right, I get my, as a mixer, I get sent over all of the stems, the multi-track specifically, for them to create a stereo mix. And from there, they would typically create, because it's been deliverable for a number of years, a set of stereo stems where at unity gain, you would have, stems were originally, drums, bass, all guitars, all keyboards, all vocals, lead vocal, or whatever. That's what stems were originally. And they've just been sort of distributed out over time, where people have gone, no, let's make a more comprehensive set of stems, which might be drums, percussion, or even kick drum, snare drum, drums, other drums, percussion, bass, guitar 1, 2, 3, all the way through, so that actually you've got more individual ability to tweak things. And that really came about because back in the olden days, when we were working on desks, analog desks, when you were mixing, you would get to, my job was to get to the end of the night when everybody else had gone home at 2 o'clock in the morning. I was still there till 4 o'clock in the morning, writing down all of the bits of outboard, drawing on little bits of paper, so that if that mix needed to be recalled because the A&R decided there needed to be more hi-hat, they would have to bring it in, put the tapes on the machine. I'd have to recall the desk, recall all of the outboard, press play, and hoped it sounded the same as it did, last week. Luckily, I didn't have to do too many of those. But that's, that was obviously, a long, long time ago, and obviously we're at a much, a much smoother area now where you've got Pro Tools people working in the box and doing all of the work there, so it's instantly recallable. But for a period of time, stems were there because it was a slightly more convenient way. It was in this kind of period between analog and digital where you could go in and do a recall without having to necessarily go back to the same studio. You could go somewhere else. That was the whole point of it. That became very useful in the 2000s, mid-2000s, where things like Rock Band, Guitar Hero, karaoke type of games were there, where they needed to dump elements with Guitar Hero, for example, drums, bass, all guitars apart from lead guitar, one stereo stem for everything else, and one for the lead vocal, because for Rock Band, those were the plasticky things that you plugged into your PlayStation. I'm not a gamer, clearly, but you get the idea. So where it's come to Atmos in the last, as this has sort of risen in the last 2-3 years, 4 years, people have been using those deliverable stems that they'd be making anyway, and that's what they've been using to make the Atmos, which makes sense. But the problem with that is that you're mixing for those two boxes. So you're making decisions based upon it blaring out of two speakers. And that's super important because everywhere in the world, that's basically what you're dealing with. Even little Bluetooth speakers that are in one box, whatever, everybody's kind of familiar with the sounds when you're working across two speakers and smashing it in there and compressing the hell out of it. And all of the stuff that we've done for ages, we're all familiar with. I always use piano as an example. If you're working on a pop rock track, if there's a piano there, typically when you record the piano, you put 3, 4, 5 microphones up, or just one, whatever, and you get the sound of a perfect sound of a piano. And then when it's in with everything else, the first thing you do is scoop out the low mid and roll off the bottom end because of all the other stuff that's coming through those speakers. Because if you've got a bass and a guitar and a vocal, all of which are occupying the 200 to 400, there's a heavy duty in the 200 to 400 hertz range. That in the piano is just going to make the whole thing sound muddy. So you scoop it out. The piano doesn't actually sound much different because you're getting those frequencies from elsewhere. You're just thinning it out so that your mix isn't cluttered and muddy. And of course, that's what you do. And then when you dedicate that down as a stem at the end of the day, fine, because all of them together create that mix. But if you listen to kind of guaranteed basically everything with the piano that's been mixed in stereo, where there's a fairly large orchestra, a sort of arrangement and other instruments playing. If you actually solo that stem, every time I do it, I solo a piano, it's like, God, that's disappointing. That doesn't sound anything like a real piano because it doesn't need to. It's never needed to. But of course, when you're working with something like Atmos, you start bringing, if you put all of your stems and left and right at the front before you start moving things out and spreading them out. Obviously, the first thing you're going to do with that piano is go, oh, blimey, that's thin. And what you usually want to do is stick a load of low mids and bottom end back in to make it sound more natural again. There's lots and lots of various areas. There's lots and lots of various areas, that we could keep going on about, but I'm aware of time. But you can kind of think for yourselves, which is the biggest thing with Atmos, is actually think about what we've been used to for 50 years, or your whole lives. I know none of you like to be as old as me, but when you think about what we've been used to and what's different about it. What have you been doing in 2 channels that you automatically, when you come and experiment in a room like this, what am I finding that I'm doing differently? As you're learning and as you're getting used to working in stereo, it's kind of an interesting time because immersive work is hopefully the kind of the future for everybody. So how do you go about it? Do you need to be kind of completely tied to the old traditions of how to make it sound great in stereo? Which of those things are super useful and super essential moving forward into the immersive space? And which of those things are actually tying you down and limiting you to old ways of thinking? Which I could bang on about all day, frankly, because I'm kind of coming across it all the time. Lots of traditional people using very traditional techniques, still thinking about things on the basis of it's coming from that speaker or that speaker or that speaker. It's like, no, it's not, because sometimes when you're listening to this, there won't be that speaker, or there'll be another 5 in between them, depending on the arrangement. So the whole point of it is that this is 128 things coming in, and it renders it down. So I'm going to play something and save my voice for a minute. I'm going to forward on a little bit, because it takes a while to get into it. Let's go maybe about 8 minutes. And I'll just think about where to go next to get as much info in as possible.
I mean, for you, what you've seen could only be the truth. What on earth does that have to do
I'll keep it playing in the background. Quieter, 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 quieter. Okay, so as you can see here, the inputs to this, there's about, what's that, 10, 20, 30, 40, 40-ish, 50 tracks, essentially. Now, they're not necessarily kick, snare, hi-hats. They might be pairs of things. They might be stems. So, in fact, I mixed this. Yeah, it's stereo drums. There's lots of stuff going on. But as you can see, none of those things are going into the bed. So none of the tracks, the stems that I had coming in are going into the bed apart from track channel 4 there, which is the subwoofer. So my approach to this, which is not the only way to do it, but it's certainly a way that lots of people are doing it, is to actually be dealing with objects in the room, which are the green inputs here and the green balls there. And those green balls floating around the room, which don't have to be moving around all the time, they can be completely static. Sometimes these big movements are, actually kind of misleading because some of them might have virtually nothing on them at all, in terms of level. But I've controlled all of those with the panner within my DAW, which you can do. So in a minute, I can show you something with that. And that means that any of those balls floating around, I can do this by opening up Pro Tools. I want to stick this on input. You only have to think of this as a master machine. Even if it's integrated into your DAW, all you need to think about is this is the way that I master it, that I record the output at the end. So I'm putting this onto input. We are going to be working here as per, I'm just trying to think of a good instrument I can use here. So I'm using the method where you're going from the DAW and into the renderer as a separate entity. Let's just think. Let's just see if I can find something kind of musical and unusual. There you go, piano, really thin piano, like exactly perfect example. This will do. Okay, so I will do no output. Stick this on output. There. Right, so I'm turning. So I'll show you what I was doing there. So that we've got a bed, and I'll put this up onto the main screen now. I'm a little bit more sorted. So actually, this is forgetting about the fact that this is actually an ADM. This is just a piece of audio, and I've got a piano playing here, which is not coming. Okay. Okay, so I've now got that in the bed. So if we do that, you can see that it's coming in through these into the bed here. So it's coming into the 10 channel, the 10 channels. So if I bring that panner up on screen, there we go. So this is the left-hand side of the piano. I'm moving it around the room, and I'm moving it. Of course, it's got automation on it, which is going to make. Oh, it doesn't go. Now, what's interesting there is because we're coming out of a bed, as you can see, we're coming into the bed. That means that there's not 4 speakers above, it's 7.1.2. So whatever I do here is it sounds like it's coming from the center. If I actually turn this into an object, which is the plan in a minute, instead of this being moving around this particular speaker selection, because if there was a 9.1 system, it wouldn't be going to that speaker. If it was an 11 point, you know what I mean? So this is now going between these speakers in a single bus. Yeah, it is automated. But now if I stick this and make this channel, 14, which is there. If I move it around the bottom, it doesn't actually sound very different because it's a 7 point something room anyway, so that would sound precisely the same. But the moment I go up high, I've now got forward and backward information as well, so I'm able to get to the whole room. There are a few other things that you can do here. Sometimes I'd advise it, sometimes I wouldn't, but you can actually change the size of this, so that's spreading that piano into the room. It's not, you probably can't hear it massively, but it doesn't change the level, it just changes how big that object is. I would use that with caution, to be honest. But basically, what we've just done, the only difference between this and stereo is that instead of mixing it between left and right, you're taking that and you're moving it around. That's exactly, at the very root of it, that's all that you need to worry about, is that you're placing something somewhere else. Yes?
Would you tend to, if you were having something as a bed,
yep.
Would you tend to just keep it static, or do people tend to
I see. Well, the bed itself, I realise what you're saying, but the bed itself is obviously always static. It's where those speaker positions are. So if you're putting something into the bed, there's no rules, hard and fast rules, and I can't tell you what to do. Of course, it's completely possible for you to, that movement I was doing then, for you to do that within a bed, or you could do it on an object. or you could just have something completely static in the bed, or you could have a completely static object. The argument for using objects over the bed is, even if it doesn't, whether it does or it doesn't move, just think about what happens if that's playing back in a room with 100 speakers. That's all you need to think about. Because I'm definitely not going to mention too many names, but we do lots and lots of playback events for records as they've come out. We've done a lot. The one we've got next week is 80s pop star Paul Young. So that's what we've got this week, actually. And last week we had a band called OPN who were on Warp, and the week before that it was something else. And the week before that it was Band on the Run by Wings. So, we're doing playbacks constantly. We often get the mixer down, the artist potentially, although McCartney didn't come down. But we do these playbacks, and if you're mixing in just a 7.1.2 bed, which is completely feasible, if you've gone, okay, I'm familiar, I find this a lot with engineers that come to Atmos going, oh, I've done 5.1, rather like my experience. I've done a bit of 5.1, I did some live shows for, whatever band. I understand that. So this is just the same, only it's just more speakers and some height. Cool. So that's your first way of coming to it, is you just start, typically if you've done some surround sound before, is that you just treat it in that way and you think about the speakers. Nothing to stop you doing that at all, and it works. If you imagine the scenario I've just talked about, though, is that there you are, 6 months later, and it's finally about to release, and then you've got a load of fans of that band going to listen to that in a movie theatre somewhere, which has got 100 speakers or 35 speakers. Remember that it's only coming from 10 of those speakers. That's basically the way to think about it. Whereas if you've made everything an object, or some things an object, then of course, as that thing moves around, or even if it's in a particular location, it's coming from it's making use of that speaker system in the best way. So to be honest, the best argument for using objects in some ways is when you think about things scaling up. However, in my opinion, and there are a lot of people I think who are finding this, is using objects even when you're folding down and scaling down actually seems to give more clarity anyway. That's just the feeling when you've got things building up here, there and everywhere. But if you were to take a 7.1.2 mix, either of music or anything that you did 5 years ago, and basically bunged it in there so it just came out of the 7.1.2 into the bed, and then exported that and made that a Dolby Atmos ADM file, a master file, it would work. So you could, the good thing about this is that you can, and one of the reasons that we have a bed in there in the first place, including you can actually I could, if I wanted to, make another bed there, purple thing there, which would be a 5.1 or a 7.1. So is because of the legacy of it, because there's a lot of content that exists, more so probably in the home entertainment world and music, but there's still loads of stuff that exists. And you will have already seen things like Ultiverb that have had 5.1 and 7.1, 5.1 certainly, for many years. There's lots of multi-channel plugins that have been around to serve the purpose. So if we didn't include channel-based stuff as part of Atmos, we wouldn't have been able to get off the ground very well, to be honest, because you've got to be able to make use of the tools that exist in the real world. We're now at a point, there's so much to talk about still, but we're now kind of at a point where, because of the integration, so what we're looking at here is Pro Tools going out of the Dolby Audio Bridge and into the renderer, and that kind of overview there of the bed, the objects, that pretty much is all you have to worry about in terms of how different it is.